Good evening. It is 5:30 p.m. on Tuesday, July 6, 2021, and this regular meeting of the Sandpoint Planning and Zoning Commission is now called to order. For the record, I am Chairman Jason Welker, presiding in council chambers at City Hall, 1123 West Lake Street in Sandpoint, Idaho. Also present are Commissioners Tom Riggs, Kate Gleesman, Slate Camp, Forrest Shuck, and Mo Stonegall. Commissioner John Hastings is absent this evening. Before we get to the development update, are there any general announcements or reports from the commissioners or from city staff?
Yes, Commissioner, I have an update from the staff.
Okay, great.
And kind of wanted to use this as an opening segue for the meeting tonight. We had our city planning position, our city planner position here at the city, which is our director of planning, but in our organizational structure. The title is city planner or principal planner. That position is currently vacant. We are looking for a good fit for the city as well as the person in the position. So that position is currently vacant, and we are actively seeking applicants for that position. We have hired a senior planner. We've had that position open since early this year, and we're really excited about a woman named Tess who is joining our team. She will be here in the next week and starting to work remotely. She has an extensive number of years of experience as a senior planner equivalent in Anacortes, which is a resort city with many of the same issues that we have here in Sandpoint. And she has a background and a lot of experience with small cities. And for us, then finding that right fit, one of the things we learned through our hiring process is someone that really understands a small city, comes from that experience, is really important for fitting in, understanding the needs and functioning in a smaller city organization, such as Sandpoint. So we do again have our city planner position open. We've had Darren Flip, who's been functioning as our interim city planner. Continuing on, he's been supporting us since the beginning of the year and continuing on in that role. In fact, he was up here in person working on pre-applications and with projects over the last week full time, and also was meeting with staff on an outline for updating our planning and zoning code, and he'll be presenting that to you tonight and kind of the plan on that front. So not only is he working remotely, but this is the second time he's been up here working in the community as well. So we're anxious to get someone on board that will be taking our time to ensure that we have the right fit for the city organization and for the person joining our community. We get many questions from people in the community asking about the structure of the city, and I thought it might be helpful specifically to pull up our organization chart for our infrastructure and development services division, because it is not a common structure around many of the similar sized cities in our area, but it's a very common structure used by cities across the country. So for clarity for the commission as well as for the public, our planning and building services group is a group within our overall infrastructure and development services division. This commission, the Planning and Zoning Commission, is supported by staff representatives from this division, both from building and planning services. Typically, our planner would be participating. In this case, our interim planner is participating, and ultimately, when we fill that position, our full-time planner will be participating and convening these meetings and coordinating with the commission. You're familiar as well with our city engineer, Dan Taddick. He leads our engineering services group, and he typically is in attendance at these meetings, although he's on vacation today, coming off of the holiday weekend. But Dan does all of the engineering reviews, particularly for the utilities as they're coming through projects, and whether he is doing them or in cases where we've had to contract some of those reviews out, that's under Dan's oversight and the reason that he participates with this group. Amanda also is typically in attendance in our Planning and Zoning Commission meetings. She is our overall director for our Infrastructure Development Services Division. And so is participating in that capacity. She's not participating in the role of the city planner, but rather as the director overseeing all of our different service groups within this division. This is a common structure that's being adopted by cities across the country as they move to a term we also use here at our city of one-stop shopping. So whether it's developers, whether it's an individual homeowner coming in with a project, they come in and have one-stop shopping through this division, and a coordinated response and pre-application meetings with our planning and building services group, as well as engineering, or if we need to bring in somebody specifically from our utility services side. On occasion, we end up doing that as well. But this was to bring all of our service groups together and ensure that we provided one-stop coordination and one-stop shopping for people coming into the city. With the remodel that is underway currently at City Hall, one of our most significant changes with that is all of our frontline services for all of our city service groups are going to be at the front desk. There's no more around the corner to parks, up the stairs to building and planning, around the corner and down the hall into another building to see police or fire. It is all the front desk services are going to be at one location on the first floor here at City Hall. So we are moved kind of all over the place right now. Building and planning is over at our community hall and serving the public there. The rest of us at the city are all crammed in upstairs, other than our frontline services right now out in the alcove. And construction on City Hall started today and will be done later this fall. So we expect to be moving in sometime in October, possibly as late as November, but all of our services will be on the first floor, and our building and our planning and building services group will be located, all of them on the first floor with conference room space so that they can meet with people there. So all of those frontline services will be combined there on the first floor for the public. So thought that would be helpful to the commission just by way of background around structure and where we are with staffing. And the purpose of tonight's meeting, the way that we aligned the agenda for the council was really to give you, or commission to give you some sense of what the development pipeline is looking like. There was a presentation to council on this about 6 weeks ago at their meeting. But for planning and zoning commission, so you can understand what is coming through the pipeline, what's coming through the pipeline that you don't see, and what is coming through the pipeline that will be on your agenda in the future, because there is a lot. There's a lot happening in terms of development, and I know people are anxious to see new projects come up to speed, and sometimes people are not so anxious because of the amount of development. But you're not always seeing that coming through here. Much of that is because our current code allows a lot of activity to happen by right. So we've asked staff to cover that tonight, so you've got some perspective on that. And then going into what is going to be coming your way relative to planning unit developments, PUDs. We haven't seen one for a number of years, and you will be having discussions about one here in upcoming weeks. And then finally to talk about a significant code overhaul and update. And we tasked Darren with trying to outline that for the last several months. So you'll be getting a preview of what that looks like, and all of those code updates will be coming back through Planning and Zoning Commission. So while you've had a bit of a hiatus in terms of activity over the last several months, that is quickly going to be changing, which is typical of what we see with the development cycles, that it's gearing up and you're not seeing it, but when it's coming, the floodgates are opening and your floodgates are officially open. So with that, I just wanted to give some overview and include that announcement to the commission. Thank you.
Can we get a copy of this PDF?
Yes,
That would be helpful.
I'm happy to send it out to you.
I wouldn't mind seeing even a
The whole organization.
yeah, see what other divisions, how this fits in with the other divisions.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. it's in our budget document where we lay out the whole organization. So just quick overview relative to our divisions of the city. We have our Infrastructure Development Services Division. Amanda is our director of that. All of these services fall under that division. We have our Public Safety Division, so that is police and fire is in that division. We have our Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Division. And Kim Woodruff heads up that division. And then finally, we have our Central Services Division, and that falls under City Administration. So that's our things like procurement, contracting, grants, finances. So those are our 4 divisions that we have across the city.
And I would encourage you, when you look at that larger grand scheme of the city operations, and encourage you to look at it and remind you that Sandpoint is unique also because it's a full service city. So when we start looking at these different divisions and who they report to, it's really important to remember that there are not a lot of our North Idaho cities specifically that are full service, meaning the city provides all of the services, public safety, police and fire, water, sewer, planning. So a lot of our cities are compartmentalized, or they utilize services from another organization or from another water district or sewer district. So Sandpoint is unique in the fact it's a full service city, and I think it's important as you look at that larger organizational chart to remember that.
Thank you. That's a good point. So as you look up and down the state, you look across states, many cities contract for services, and then there are a smaller number of cities that provide contract services. And as we're seeing growth in our area, Sandpoint, not only in terms of being a full service city, but in terms of contract services, we are doing more of that. We currently contract with the city of Kootenai for police services relative to fire services. If you haven't seen the announcement, we did restructured fire services, our consolidated fire services under Selkirk Fire with a new joint powers agreement, and all of the employees within the Selkirk Fire Services areas, that City of Sandpoint employees, that's West Side Fire District and Sago Fire District, all of those employees came under the city. So they are, as of about a week ago, employees of the City of Sandpoint. So and we are contracting then those employees out, but we have shared management for our shared fire services. So that definitely is one thing that's unique. In fact, when we attend the Association of Idaho Cities groups and meetings, they have moved us out of the smaller city groups. We're typically attending the larger city meetings with Boise and larger cities around the state because we have more in common in terms of the complexity, the services, and the issues that we face as a city with those larger cities than we do the cities closer to our size who are contracting out for more services.
Jennifer, do you mind explaining the difference between senior planner and city planner? Just very briefly.
Our senior planner, and Amanda can probably talk specifically to experience with that. Our city planner is our principal planner, or what in other cities is known as director of planning. And typically when it's a planning director, it's not within this structure, and you typically have more employees. So that is the person responsible, principally responsible for planning at the city, the planning activities. Our senior planner, that's somebody with significant years of experience who's able to make senior level decisions in planning. We've actually reclassed our position. Previously, we had a planner 2, so more of a mid-level planner, but with the volume of activity that is coming through the city, the challenges with the growth, the long-range planning that needs to happen, in addition to the current range planning, we've reclassed that position to a senior planner position. And I think she's got 10 years experience.
No.
It's what she brings to the table, and our requirement was it's about 7-8 years experience minimum to be a senior planner. Whereas typically a planner 2, you can get somebody with maybe 2 or 3 years of planning experience. They're relatively new within a planning department. So Sarah, who is our planning assistant, she's been with us for about 1.5 years. And typically through planning, there's the opportunity for growth. And so classifications are a planning assistant, which could be a planner 1, a planner 2, a planner 3 or 4, which is your senior planner, and then ultimately your principal planner, which is your city planner.
Are there any other questions or comments from the commission?
Are there more positions here than in recent past, like the last couple of years, or is this pretty close to what we've had?
We have had 3 positions in our planning group. We have not, again, we've reclassed up to the senior planner level. We have not typically in the past also had a contract support in planning, but I anticipate at least for the next year, you'll see that we will continue to have contract support just because the volume of what's going through. You're typically seeing, again, we have Darren engaged in those activities, comes with decades of experience, Idaho experience at City of Boise, functioning as our interim planner. At the point that we hire a city planner, we'll probably, again, we'll be at the point where Darren is continuing with some of the projects that he's working on, but as you're going to hear tonight, that will free him to shift up more to the code updates that need to be completed. It could be argued at this point that we need a planning group of at least 4 that are full-time on staff, and it's a difficult balance for us. We're in a difficult time as a city where we're seeing the amount of growth, and we've also seen this amount of growth actually not at the level that we're seeing now, but we saw high amounts of growth in 2008, 2009, and we're back up at that and beyond it, significantly beyond it, as you're going to see tonight. But the challenge is, does that growth continue or not? And we don't want to be adding permanent positions in the city that then we're laying off if that changes. So we've chosen to go the route with consultants in addition to Darren. You've previously met Diane Cushland, who's been involved with projects. She's still engaged on contract as well, and is brought in to help with projects when we need those, can help with code changes if needed. So we retain that contract with her as well, and she's arguably the most experienced, most nationally recognized planner in the state of Idaho. So she continues to be in that supportive role. She's also was involved with us actually when our positions became vacant after Aaron and Ryan had left, in rewriting our positions and really thinking about the structure of our department and the job descriptions. Diane assisted us in those efforts. She actually drafted the job descriptions for us. We spent a lot of time talking with her about, while positions were vacant, what really made sense for an organization our size within the planning profession, what made sense for job description, roles, pay, and structure of the organization. So we work closely with Diane.
I have a question on the natural progression for opportunities to move ahead within the city organization. Would you say that some of this reflects that opportunity is being present?
It is present in some extent over time. It's hard for progression in an organization the size of ours.
Yeah.
Where we need experienced individuals. So at the point that we're in now, a question could be asked when we had a senior planner position open. Sarah had been with the organization, so wouldn't it make sense for that progression to occur with Sarah? Well, Sarah only has a year and a half of experience working for us, and our senior planner requires somebody with 7-8 years of growth and experience in planning. So in the future, Sarah's still with us. There's those opportunities, and typically we have promoted within our service groups, but some of it depends on timing, whether those opportunities are available based on how long staff have been on board.
Is there any significance to the yellow contractors consultant?
Other
Just
than
yellow.
event, other than just noting that those are not on staff. That's why we call them in. And arguably, probably within this chart, we should have had the box too for contractors, consultants under planning. We're finding typically in our engineering services groups, as well as planning and building, particularly in building. Historically, when we've seen peaks in volumes here, we've contracted out services. So in engineering services, we'll contract out assistance with some of the utility reviews, traffic studies. So you've heard from some of our consultants relative to traffic studies. Sometimes it might be on stormwater plans just because of the volume that's coming through. Our engineer is responsible not only for reviewing those plans coming through, but also for our own city projects that we have underway in some of our master planning efforts. Right now, with the current planning impacts and the development that's going through, Dan, to a great extent, is probably about 90% of his time on reviewing development and building projects that are coming through, as opposed to city projects. We've moved a lot of that volume down to our construction manager, Holly. So we're at a real pinch point that we've got our own projects moving through, and development is definitely impacting us at the city. Likewise, with our building official, we have typically had a contract with a local engineering firm to provide inspection support and function as our building official when our building official is out. Right now, due to the volume of work, that's not even feasible. We can't find someone to contract, not locally, not out of town, not large, not small firm. We're not able to find it at all. So actually, we're in the process of making a change to this org chart too, where our permit technician, part-time inspector, Sean, he's gone through training and is fully competent as a building inspector, and he'll be doing that work predominantly full-time here in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Right now, he spends about 40% of his time doing inspections. For Christine, we rarely have her in the office just because of the volume of inspections. What we're seeing currently on the construction front is everyone is trying to get their foundations in now, while the weather is nice, so that they can do all of the dry-in work over the winter time. So the call for foundation inspections right now is we're off the charts from what we've seen. We are seeing right now, in terms of building volume in the city, the number of building permits that are coming through the city right now in a month are equivalent to our highest quarter of building permits that we've seen in prior years. So volume for staff is 300, 400, 500% of what we've typically seen. But we, again, with staffing, are trying to take as much of a conservative approach as possible, both in terms of what our funds are available, and also if we see a downturn of the market where we're using more contractors or consultants. But council and the mayor has directed us to make sure that we can continue to keep projects moving. And I think where we're seeing a real pinch point right now is current planning is becoming so dominant. It's far more dominant and taking up all of our time and limiting the long range planning. So that's one of the pieces we're really going to need to sort through and figure out, even for planning and zoning commission, as you've got a large volume of applications and considerations that are going to come through to you. How do we balance that with getting long range planning on the plate? We intend to get into discussions with the county about planning for our area of city impact, and actually entering into an agreement to consider area of city impact, and that will be a significant discussion for planning and zoning. We were queued up to start that discussion as we were moving through the comp plan, but then it was overnight, the current planning, it was at our door and beating the door down. So, and then with some of our community planning efforts relative to the comp plan also got put on hold just because of COVID and the ability to really effectively engage the community in those discussions. It was really challenging as we were finishing up some of our other plans. We felt that we really needed clearly to have robust plan, community involvement in the comprehensive plan, then we'll have to pick that up again here moving into the fall. So you'll be seeing discussion about that. And then the mayor and I, in fact, had a conversation about it today, about getting that back moving again this fall.
It'll sound like with the code rewrite that's coming down the pipeline, there's plans to have quite a bit of community involvement and feedback in that.
Absolutely, because this is, as Darren will present to you tonight, this is a total overhaul and reorg of our code. I have to say that both of the consultants that we've involved to support our planning efforts have been at the table and within weeks that you've got to get your code overhauled. It's difficult to find things. We get conflicting language, and you can see where we had taken some code changes to council a couple months back that really weren't about overall zoning changes. It was administrative cleanup to get to council just because we were getting pinch points and holding up projects moving forward because there was intention, interpretation of something in code just wasn't clear. But when it comes to significant code changes that affect land use, that affect specific zones within the city, absolutely those things come through planning and zoning. And we think we're at a point again with community involvement and ability to effectively engage the community in those discussions. And they're probably going to be more difficult than ever because what may have been the perception on what we wanted to allow even a year or two ago is going to look maybe very different to people very impacted by growth around them.
Absolutely. I do wonder to an extent what the rush is for some of this development, because I think back to the projects or the permits, CUPs and subdivisions that have been approved in the last year and a half. And I see many of them not going forward a year and a half after their CUPs were approved. And it makes me wonder why did we, I guess it wasn't so urgent, didn't feel rushed 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. But I look all over town and every time I drive past certain properties, I say, oh, we approved a permit for development of that. And they haven't even broke ground yet. So I wonder, permits that are approved or subdivisions that are approved now, is it your sense that these will be broken ground on within the next 6 months or a year? Or are we going to see more of what we saw last year where it might be a 2-year delay after a permit's approved?
I think that you're going to substantially see more happening in the 6 months to the year, but realistically, I think sometimes you get developers that come in and leave the community and the commission with the impression that you're going to see a development move forward and you're going to see 50 houses in that development in the next 6 months. That just is not typical. And we're seeing that with some of the projects that came through planning and zoning. So even though we were told that they were ready to go and needed to have all these houses, that's often the approach with developers, that they've got a rush project and it's to get things moving through and we're not moving through fast enough. But some of those projects, you'll see with the development tracker tonight, you're going to see some of those that went through you several months ago and you haven't heard anything about popping back up. Cedar Ridge is one of those that was contentious and went through planning and zoning and ultimately to council. And there's a few others that you'll see on the development tracker that there's some activity going on. So I think we're a bit overdue in having this discussion with Planning and Zoning Commission. And I think it's good for the commission as well as to the community, because I think there's a lot of pent-up frustration right now around the housing needs and feeling like not much is going on, but city staff are saying they're really busy. And so tonight's attempt is really to try to bring more transparency to that and so you know what's coming through, but also what's moving through that has already been on your plate, what's moving through that you're not going to see on your plate, but by right is happening.
Chairman makes a great point about the timeline and not seeing development after we feel like it's important to decide on. Is it appropriate to ask for a timeline in order for the city to plan?
I think we're going to address that.
Okay.
Is there anything that we could do different that would help this process be
we convene special meetings, and you might see as we're presenting what's coming through, that may come up that it's a need for more special meetings. So that may be a conversation that happens with planning and zoning. There are the required meetings stated per month, that just like what we do with council, sometimes we have things coming through and we'll convene special meetings. So I think with that, Commissioner, I would suggest, I want to give you the high level overview, and I'd really like to pass it on to you to move forward with the agenda for the staff presentation. And if there's anything with that I can help fill in, I certainly will be happy to. And I appreciate you giving me the time to kind of give you the overview, and certainly appreciate the discussion with the commission. So thank you.
Melissa, just a point, we can't see anything on our screens right now. So our screens have gone black since Jennifer's computer timed out.
Sorry.
So with that, we will move on to the agenda. Next is the approval of meeting minutes. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the May 4th, 2021 meeting.
Second.
All in favor, say aye, please.
Aye.
Okay, great. Minutes approved. Motion passes. All right, there's no.
Excuse me,
Yes,
Mr.
sorry.
Chairman, I'm sorry, we had one other update by
Oh.
staff.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay.
This is the general pipeline update.
Mhm,
Okay, I thought that's, thank you.
That's okay.
You're up.
Thank you. And good evening. We're really excited to have this conversation. I know that you all have many questions, and so we really want to give an opportunity to answer them this evening. I will say that we could have a several-hour conversation about developments in the pipeline. It's a really exciting topic. Staff loves to talk about it, and there's a lot in the pipeline, as you're going to hear this evening. My intent is to make this relatively brief and really get your questions answered. My intent is not to dive into the weeds of every single project that's in the pipeline. This is more that 30,000 foot view, unless you have specific questions about something that you just would like a little bit more information on. But I'd like to give you just sort of a bigger picture. And before I begin, I also want to really thank my team for helping to put together this data. Anytime we're talking about development data, there are a variety of different ways we can look at it. There's different ways that people think of the data. And so if you're looking at this presentation tonight and you'd like to see it in a different form, or you don't feel like your question was really answered based upon the data that we're presenting, please don't hesitate to let us know, and we'll do our best to get you the answers that you're looking for. So with that, I'm going to show you a couple slides on facts, and then we're going to get into kind of the fun part. So this first chart that's in front of you are building permits that are issued. And I want to be really clear about the word issued. This is representing applications that are currently approved, and that's what we mean by issued. So this does not mean an application that's in process, being reviewed, and hasn't been approved for construction yet. That's what's represented here. Building permits include all building permits. So that can include something like a re-roof permit. You have to have a building permit for that, a remodel, doing an addition on your house. So all of those permits are captured into this, and it's representing the last 5 years, trying to show a trend. We're going to go into more details about some of those other variables that I just mentioned, things like applications and review or projects that are currently under construction. But what I think is a really key takeaway here is we are June ended on this chart, our second quarter of the year. So this is not in fiscal year, it's truly in year quarters. So the end of June represents quarter 2. And as you can see on here, we are off the charts compared to the last 5 years. We anticipate that our third quarter is going to be a similar at similar volume as what we saw in this second quarter. As Jennifer mentioned, we have a lot of folks that are in the pipeline right now, getting ready to get building permits, or they're under review. So our third quarter is going to be much higher than our past third quarters. And ultimately at the end of the year, I think we're going to have to adjust the right side of our permit to have a larger number be visible. So I wanted to show you this, and also our zoning applications. So this represents, again, through the end of June, a little bit different than building permits. These are all the applications that are in zoning or under zoning review specifically. So that would be things like subdivisions, short plats, lot line adjustments, conditional use permits. And it's a little bit deceiving because every single building permit also has a zoning review, right? It also has an engineering review. So we say zoning in this chart, what we're really meaning are zoning applications. But again, please recognize that all building permits have all three of those disciplines included with them. So now for the fun, I think it's fun numbers. There's a lot on this slide here. This is what we call the pipeline or the pending development. And as you work, we have three columns. We have under construction, pending permits, and coming soon. So as you work your way from left to right, on the left-hand side, under construction, those are permits and actual new dwelling units that are currently actively being built. So our level of confidence in the fact that those are going to be new residential units is really high because they're actively under construction. As we work our way to the right of this slide, to the coming soon, our level of confidence gets less because they haven't applied necessarily. So let's just dive into this really quick. So under construction, we have 73 new residential dwelling units that are currently being constructed. They do not have a certificate of occupancy yet for occupying in that regard. Of the above, 32 of them were building permits that were issued year to date this fiscal year. So the difference there are building permits that were issued in prior years and they just haven't finished construction. Pending permits, going to that middle permit or middle column there. This is trying to represent that we have a high level of confidence. I'll just jump to the punchline there in the purple, that 147 units are near being permitted. And what I mean by near, I would say within the next couple of weeks or by the end of this month, we'll have another 147 units that are approved for construction. So 17 are currently in staff's queue to review. 43 are currently in an applicant's queue to revise and resubmit or give us additional information so that we can approve the application. And then that's where you get to the, of these 147 are dwelling units. We represent that because the numbers above include things like the remodels and additions. We might have a commercial permit such as a hangar up there. Well, that's not a residential unit, right? So we did not pull and produce on these slides the data on commercial development, hangars, and industrial projects. Although it's represented in the number of building permits in the pipeline, obviously they don't have dwelling units associated with them. I'm going to summarize the right column real quick, and then I'll pause for some questions. So things that are coming soon. And I think that we could really spend a lot of time on this particular column because it speaks to so many of the questions that you were just asking. We have a lot of projects that we've had pre-application meetings for. We have a relatively high level of confidence that they are likely to move forward with a project, but we don't necessarily have an application for them yet, or you're not necessarily seeing them on the agenda. So for example, to your question of could we have more meetings, would that help this process? In this case, it's not necessarily about a meeting or not being able to get on an agenda, and that's what's delaying things. Oftentimes people are contemplating whether or not they want to purchase a piece of property, right? And so those are often the calls that we get. We also get calls of, I just purchased this property and now I'm working with a planner and an engineering firm to develop the layout that I would like. And we do multiple iterations of back and forth with them on minimum lot size and utility layouts and how are we going to have your roads in here. So there's a lot of back end discussions with staff. What's not on here is just someone calling us saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing a subdivision in the city. What are your thoughts on that? Or what code do I go look at? That's not here. We do get those as well. What's on this slide is where we have a relative bit of confidence that they will be submitting an application in the near future. They've either purchased the property, they're under contract to buy the property, and that is where that first bullet point is really being contemplated from. The second there is really to the point that Mr. Welko, that you brought up. You have approved as of recently 3 preliminary plats, or I apologize, you didn't approve, you recommended for approval or not. The preliminary plats for 3 fairly substantial subdivisions. So those folks are actively working. they're not building structures on them at this point, because until they can actually sell those lots and pull a building permit, they have to complete all the public infrastructure and then come forward for a final plat. Once a final plat is approved by council, then they can sell the lots and then we can issue building permits for them. So to your point, there are 200 roughly single-family residential homes that have very recently been approved. That's just single-family residential homes. To your point, you previously approved a conditional use permit for the Ridge at Cedar. That is and has been actively underway. So their first step was they actually had to do a short plat to get their whole lot lines in order before they could pull a building permit. So they've been working on that. They've been working on their building plans and their construction drawings, right? So you approved it. They were in a rush to get going. It's just typically when someone is looking to purchase a piece of property, they want a level of confidence that it's compliant with city code and that they know all the potential conditions that are going to be imposed on them when they do go to pull a building permit. So that's really what you saw there and what you're going to continue to see. You might have a conditional use permit or a subdivision preliminary plat, and you won't see it developed for some time because there's a lot of steps that have to happen before a house gets built on it. But the conditional use permit that was approved, Cedars, that is the third bullet. So right now there are 115 to 180 new dwelling units that we have a relatively high level of confidence on that can pull a building permit. They don't require any additional approvals from planning and zoning or city council. So some people refer to it as by right, meaning they've already completed the conditional use process or subdivision process, such as a final plat, or the code just doesn't require it, such as being in a commercial zone, right? A commercial zone can build multifamily, more than 8 units, and it doesn't require planning and zoning or city council approval. That's for our code. So when we add all of those up, that's the 115 to 180 new dwelling units that's on this. We're also anticipating a couple zone changes, potentially some PUDs associated with them. We have another food truck conditional use permit coming your way. And then last, but certainly not least, it is a pending sale, so I would rather at this point not get too far into the weeds on the location. But I anticipate next month, you may see a conditional use permit for 182 new dwelling units. Again, it'll take some time for them to be under construction because they're just in the purchasing phase right now. So you add all the purple up, and that's on the bottom left, a total of approximately 800 units that are in the pipeline that we have a relatively high level of confidence on.
Do you know the ratio of that 800 that is single family versus multifamily?
That's a good question. Off the top of my head, I would estimate we're at about 50-50. We have some really significantly sized multifamily. One of the biggest, and I'm happy to speak about it because we do have an application that's been approved. When I say application, I mean a site plan review. They've gone through the process of getting approvals. Once they pay for their building permits, they can start building. That is the Samuelson Seniors and Samuelson Place. So that's about 139 units. And that is located at Great Northern and Woodland. So that's a significant multifamily development with a lot of units in it. So it's a rough estimate on 50%. I would have to look a little bit closer at it, but that's kind of what my gut says.
But that doesn't include the southern portion of University Place. That requires rezone, is that correct?
Correct. Yes. And our next slide is about University Place. So I'm happy to touch about that as well. Any questions or thoughts on this? I know it's a lot of numbers. I will say it's ever evolving. If I gave this presentation a week from today, every one of these numbers was going to look different. It's kind of like a schedule. It changes constantly.
I think the one thing that I would add is that we're tracking these on an administrative level to just make sure that we can get these processed. And again, what our plans are weekly. We meet on this on our leadership team. It's pipeline at about 750 to 800 units with projects falling off, new projects coming on. I would say that we've been consistently at that 800 volume anticipated to come through and somewhere in the pipeline since about January. So we've been holding true to that number. And again, I think this speaks to the impact of current planning and why some of the long-range planning, current planning has taken up so much of the staff time, planning and building wise because of the volume. That even meeting with developers who are looking at projects that are somewhere in that pipeline, they drop off and now they're replaced by something else. So staff are meeting with another developer, looking at some other type of project at the same location. That's commonly happened the last several months.
You know about how many are apartment or condo or?
So multifamily kind of being the overarching umbrella for apartments in this case, I would say approximately 50%. That's a rough order of magnitude. It might be a little bit more.
So in a situation where one property has single family dwelling in the front and accessory dwelling in the back, that comes to.
No, that's not considered multifamily. That's single family residential. Even a duplex is considered single family residential, even though it's 2 units.
So it's used dwelling unit,
Mhm.
not like a building.
Think of kitchens. How many kitchens? That's probably the easiest way to think of it. So you are correct. If someone had an ADU in the back and a single family residence up front, that would be 2 dwelling units. Yes, but it would still be a single family residential. It wouldn't be classified as multifamily.
Okay, so dwelling units are separate.
Yes. They're basic. I always think of like how many kitchens. That's the easiest way to explain a dwelling unit. It's not bedrooms, it's just dwelling units. So, and typically, I believe our census is sitting right around 2.59 people per dwelling unit. So that was the last, but that's been about 10 years since that number was provided. So I think another kind of important piece, at least from a staffing perspective, since we had this conversation earlier, is that not only within city limits are we seeing growth, but obviously our entire region is seeing a lot of growth. So when our water and sewer crew sees a number like 800 units in the pipeline, they think new connections, right? That's 800 new taps on a main. That's 800 more homes or units going to our treatment facility plant. We also serve regionally water. And so that growth that's happening in Ponderay and Kootenai and our surrounding areas is also hitting the same staff that you noticed up above, as well as our administrative support staff who are processing those permits and those approvals that have to get through as well. So it's really been an all hands on deck effort. And I think that these numbers only tell one portion of the story. It's like I said, ever evolving. And so we'll continue to track it. And I'm really excited to, see some of the applications that are coming your way, not only from a subdivision preliminary plat approval and recommendation process. I think those coming your way soon. The zone changes and PUDs that are going to be coming your way soon are really going to be very interesting. And that's in part why we wanted to have some training on PUDs, because it's been a long time since we've talked about that. And then the conditional use permit as well. So I anticipate your August, September, and October are going to be much busier than the last quarter has been, at least from a planning and zoning commission perspective. But we also wanted to let you know that things are still happening in the background, even though we're not meeting as much. And then last but not least, I have a very brief update on University Place within this pipeline discussion. So great point. That is part of the update. It was approved by City Council as University Park. Long story short, the county has a review process within subdivision names and street names to make sure from a safety perspective, EMS, that we don't have too many University Park subdivisions within our county, so that when you're telling a firefighter or an EMS vehicle, hey, you need to go to University Park, they don't go which one, that we only have unique names within our county. So they had to change their name from University Park to University Place. So
that was the mistake I was constantly making.
You were not making a mistake. So when it goes for final plat, it'll be formally changed. Yep. But I'm impressed you caught it. So any other questions on this slide before I move on?
I just have one
Yeah.
quick, and maybe staff can answer or not. But the little development at Walnut and Division with the small cottages and the ADUs in the back, are those lots separated between the ones with the ADUs on them? Or are they all one lot?
They're all one lot. Well, let me be clear. So there's a single family residential that faces Walnut. The ADU directly behind it is on the same lot as the one that's on the street.
Okay.
Does that answer it? Meaning
Yeah,
all
it does.
ADUs
You know,
are
it just
not.
has the appearance that, then they could be separate, so I just wanted some clarification on that. And is an ADU sellable? Can you,
No,
so no one can apply for it?
it is, I'm not going to use the word ancillary. It's incidental to the single family structure. So it's accessory. It's an accessory dwelling unit. So it has to have a primary structure on it to be able to be an ADU. And you can't have two single family dwellings on a single lot. So they would have to have a condo plat to be able to sell them individually, but the land itself couldn't be sold.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And just for whatever it is or isn't worth, those were original lots, original substandard lots of record. So those are much narrower lots and they were already platted before they pulled building permits. That's why they never came to the commission. That's why they never came to city council. They could by right pull a building permit on them, and our code already addressed substandard single family lots like that.
I think I recall them as being 10 lots, 25 feet.
Very narrow. Anything else? Okay. All right, quick update on University Place. So we anticipate that City Council will be asked to consider approving final plats for phase 1, phase 2, and phase 4 this summer and fall, most likely in that order. The work on phase 1 has been progressing quite rapidly since the spring started, and they are going to be doing final paving this week, as long as they get all their paperwork in and everything, every T has been crossed and every I has been dotted from a paperwork perspective. We anticipate taking that to City Council on July 21st for a final plat approval. And that is approved and the plat is recorded, they can start pulling building permits on that. So they currently have one house that's been constructed on phase 1, because technically there's only one lot, so they could have pull one building permit. But I anticipate we'll be seeing a lot more construction on phase 1. That's the northern, you can see my cursor here. That's this phase right here.
Where's phase 4?
Phase 4 is actually where this line is here. You can see my cursor, and south of that. So it's about the southern third of the property.
Will University Parkway become University Place Way?
That is a question I don't have the answer to. I'm sorry. Good question. So each, and that's part of the final plat process. Every one of those proposed street names has to be confirmed by the county before it can go on the plat. That process has been kind of cleaned up in the last year and a half or so ago. And so phase 2 has also been under construction, and they are actively working towards getting a final plat, at least for half of phase 2, most likely by August, so that they can start constructing some of those single family homes. And then we anticipate a phase 4 final plat. What that means is these will be final platted as large lots, but a final plat means that they've completed all public infrastructure. So the roads and the curb and the water and sewer, those are all done and have been accepted by the city when they're asking for a final plat approval. So that would be phase 4. They want to get all of that construction done and accepted by the city this summer, and then move into a phase 4 replat and rezone as was originally contemplated in the first round of the preliminary plat approval. So essentially looking at those larger lots and replatting them to after final plat to further subdivide them, as well as rezone them. And then potentially they're kicking around options for if a PUD is going to be in their best interest or not. So they're still working on those details, but I anticipate that might be part of the equation. And as far as timing goes, I would say probably late fall. It's most likely when you'll see that. And then in progress, I just wanted to make sure and let the commission and the public know that they are actively working towards the land trust dedications that were originally discussed. They have made improvements to the area there in the center. I had the pleasure of getting to walk it a couple weeks ago, and there's some really lovely pathways along this. They're planning to keep water in it throughout the year by introducing water to it when it's typically dry. And there's a really lovely walking path around it as well. And this area will eventually be dedicated to the Connexu Land Trust as well as this section here. It hasn't been dedicated because it can't, because it hasn't been final platted. So that is just a process element. And again, it can't be final platted until they get all their public infrastructure done. So that's why these things tend to take a while.
What do you mean by dedicated?
Their intent, as I understand it, is to dedicate via deeds to the Connexu Land Trust, that is for them to maintain in perpetuity and to use for the public's benefit.
So KLT will just determine the degree of public access.
Yes, as long as it's consistent with the final plat. Yes.
Conservation.
No.
It would be owned by the-
Yes. Yes.
being managed by the-
Well, it's both. Yes. Owned and managed. Part of the reason I say managed is that the stormwater treatment and retention at this site primarily goes to the KLT section. So the management of that stormwater is really important. So making sure that that's all really well incorporated into the CCNRs, and that is part of the paperwork. When I say all that has to be in good order before it gets through.
Can you remind us if the University Place subdivision had the same requirements of other areas in San Francisco, such as sidewalks, or these things that are going to be in there? I've been in a recent subdivision in Ponderay in which there are no sidewalks nor curbs. And maybe others, so that might be what we.
No need to be nervous. Subdivisions have to have curbs and sidewalk and a buffer zone and trees and lights and all kinds of good things.
Any questions?
Is there any thought of what the plan is east of the tracks? I thought there was some decision-
Oh, in this section,
Yeah, being made commercial.
it is not commercial. In fact, it's actually owned by the Idaho Idaho Transportation Department. So it is with some, I'm trying to find a word for it. Some interesting, that's the word I'm gonna use, some interesting easements. So the surveyor is working through all of that. Those are kind of the finite details that have to come together before they ask for a final plat on that section to the east of the tracks there, on the southern half east of the tracks, that commercial area that you were talking about where it says C sheet 8, this little section here, and portions of this. What's north, that is all still intended to be KLT as originally displayed. So the surveyors get the joys of working through all of those old easements that are literally from the 30s at times and 20s. Mhm. Yep. Anything else? Okay, then. Well, thank you very much for your time.
We've already approved the minutes from the last meeting. I think Melissa, you brought that up. Great. And there's no old business on the agenda this evening, so we will move on to new business. First, under new business is a primer on the purpose, application, and process for PUDs, which will be led by interim city planner Darren Fluke and city legal counsel Fonda Jovich. Yeah, Darren, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Fonda and I are going to tag team this, and so as usual, it's going to be a fairly non-formal presentation, and we'd encourage you to ask questions as we go, as they arise. We just have a few slides here. We'll keep it fairly brief. And I would note for you all that I'm having just a little trouble hearing the commissioners. So I'm not sure where the microphones are, but it may be that we need to have one of the Amanda or another staff person relay those questions for us. but I'll do my best.
We could probably speak closer into our microphones.
There you go. I heard that. Okay, so let's get right into it. As far as the textbook definition goes, and I hate slides like this, but I'm going to do it to you anyway because I think it's important to start. And I just want to quickly read this for you about the textbook definition of a planned unit development. It's a tract of land developed as a unit under single ownership or unified control, including one or more principal buildings or uses where the land is planned as a single unit again, rather than an aggregate of individual lots. Design flexibility from traditional siting regulations such as side yard setbacks, height limitations, or land use restrictions such as prohibitions against the mixing of land uses allow greater flexibility in return for public benefits or amenities. I know that's a mouthful, and so in other words, I would just tell you that a PUD is both a process and a plan that allows for flexibility in zoning standards in return for public benefits. So this little table that you've got here shows you the standards that we can potentially provide flexibility in, and that would be in the mix of land uses within a project, the density of a project. There we're thinking really of residential density, but it could be commercial floor area as well, or even industrial in some cases. Setbacks, bulk mass and height standards, road width standards. Public benefits could include things such as open space and public amenities, higher quality design, both architecture and site design, housing affordability. And I say that intentionally to mean that you can sort of negotiate with the applicant on the range of housing options here. I'm not speaking of affordable housing per se. I'm just talking more of a range of housing choices within a given project. And enhanced landscaping is also.
Your screen might be frozen because your slides have not advanced since you started speaking. So I think you're probably referring to slides that we can't see.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
So you heard me read that, right?
Yeah, I think you might be on the next slide.
And that's the slide I was referring to there that I was just on. And so the little table there is what I was where I was going through the factors that we could offer flexibility and the potential public benefits. Those are not meant to be one for the other. Those are just a range of things that are allowed within the planned unit development process. The big takeaway for the commission is that the planned unit development is really a process that allows you to offer flexibility to the applicant in return for public benefit. Something that's good for the public that says, okay, you might get to not follow the standards of the ordinance to the letter of the law, but in return, you're going to give the public these various amenities. Just want you to know that this is allowed for by the state statutes. Specifically, it's in the Local Land Use Planning Act, Idaho Code 676515. And that does, provide the authority for localities to do this. Sandpoint specifically provides for the planned unit development process within Title 10, the subdivision ordinance, but there's also zoning standards, of course, in Title 9 that we're dealing with. Fonda, did you want to add anything here on the legal entitlements?
No, the only thing I would add is that I would encourage you to go into Title 10, Chapter 3, which is the planned unit development section in the Sandpoint City Code, and review that. We didn't provide it in the packet. I've had to review it a number of times just as we anticipate a possible PUD coming through, but I would encourage you all to read that section of Sandpoint City Code. And call me if you have any questions or issues with interpretation.
So I did it to you again. I told you I hate these slides, and I put another one in here with a whole lot of text. I'm not going to read this to you because we can make it available to you afterwards. But know that what I was just talking about is specifically allowed for in Title 10 of your code. The purpose, of course, is to provide that choice in living environments and a more useful pattern of open space, Basically it's all about good design. That's what planned unit developments are all about. And I want to make a distinction here between a planned unit development and a subdivision and a rezone. It's entirely possible and in fact probable that you'll see these applications come to you at the same time. A subdivision is a very particular animal within both the state code and your own code. And the preliminary plat is actually the tool that implements a subdivision process. And so here you're seeing an actual plat, and it's a very technical document. And you can think of it, the easiest way to think of it is that when a developer is selling somebody an 8,000 square foot lot, that lot actually has 8,000 square feet in it. And that when we say roads or right-of-ways are 60 feet in width, that we truly have 60 feet of right-of-way. This is really just an outgrowth of the Wild West days where land speculators sold things to people that they may or may not have owned, and that may or may not have included the amount of square footage that they said was there, that the boundary may or may not have coincided with land that they actually owned, and considerations like that, that we get all the easements accounted for, so that if somebody had given you an easement in the past or sold you an easement so that you could have a water line across their property, that doesn't go away because land next to you is now being further divided. And so when you see a planned unit development application, basically you're looking at what the code would call a preliminary development plan. And it ought to include a very generalized depiction of the land uses, the phasing, and just how things are going to be arranged. This is your kind of pretty picture, where your plat is actually the document that implements the whatever you all approve for the applicants. And so here I just put together a montage of images that from various different planned unit developments from various jurisdictions. And you can see there a phasing plan and some other just, different layouts of projects. So, I told you I would keep it brief, and I meant that. And so that's what I had on that, hoping that maybe that was going to stimulate some questions and or discussion on the commission. So at this point, I would open all of that up for any questions that you might have, and we'll do our best to answer those.
Were there any PUDs in city limits right now?
Yes, I can speak to that if you would like. Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please.
So Cedars at Sand Creek was one of the most recently amended PUDs in the city. So are you familiar where that is? So Schweitzer Cutoff and North Boyer Road, that entire subdivision to the north there of Schweitzer Cutoff was a PUD. It had 5 phases with, as Darren mentioned, multiple subdivisions, plats, preliminary plat approvals, as well as final plats with it. And so that was a fairly substantial PUD. Another is Seasons, that was done as a PUD. So those are the 2 that come to mind right off the top of my head as far as recent ones that most people know about. Though the initial approval most recently was all the way back in 2008, if my memory is correct. They were subsequently amended, but an initial new PUD for the commission to review and city council to consider, it has been a substantial amount of time since we've seen one. So.
I just need to clarify, Darren, a little more about the difference between the PUD and the subdivision and rezone. My impression is that the PUD, and is it planned or planning unit development? Planned, okay. A single developer owns all the land and builds all the houses or amenities or other things that are on it. And does that developer sell those to different individuals? And how is that different from a subdivision and rezone? Is that where there's just a plat to subdivide the land and then each lot is sold to someone who builds whatever zoning allows on it? Can you clarify, I guess, how who owns what for how long between the two?
Sure. And I think what I hear you saying is, is the developer obligated to build the entire thing himself, or can they sell discrete portions of it? Are you all seeing the montage again of the different layouts?
Yes.
Okay, so look at the one at the top left, and the answer is that one of the big advantages for doing all of the upfront work on a PUD to the developer is he could then act as a master developer, and he would have the ability to sell discrete components of that overall approval to another developer who might want to do the project. And so the way that it typically works is you come in and get an approval for a planned unit development, and maybe you're a developer who likes to do some of that. And so you go ahead and you build phase one of the project. In the meantime, and you build your utilities in there and you do the platting and all of those kind of things. And then, you're able to sell individual lots for building permits, or maybe you're a builder as well. And so you can pull those building permits and actually build the project. And then maybe in the meantime, you have a developer friend who would like to get in on the action and buy phase two. And so you could sell him phase two. He could come to the city with a new plat at that point. Probably it would be a final plat, as long as it's in conformance with what we approved at the PUD. And as long as it's in, it conforms with that development concept and we get the public benefits, and they're complying with all the requirements on utilities and lot sizes and street widths and all of those things, then you can sell off those discrete components. So you can do it either way.
And then a subdivision is different in that instead of a developer buying different phases or sub-developers buying different phases, just individuals buy individual lots and build whatever is allowed on them.
Well, that is a distinction. I mean, it's not the only one. I mean, a typical subdivision is just that. It's just dividing up a large parcel of ground into individual lots that people can then purchase and put, a structure on. Typically a single family dwelling, if we're just thinking of your standard subdivision. In the case of a PUD, it's basically putting a lot more forethought into it and saying, if you allow me to get a higher density, or you allow me to create narrower lots than what the zone allows for, I will in turn be able to provide you this better open space. The public will get dedication of 5 acres instead of 1 acre of open space. Or I will be able to provide a better and higher quality architectural design that has sort of a consistent theme that runs through the entire development. They just, they act as more as a cohesive unit, regardless of who is doing the developing of the final product.
And for a subdivision, is a rezone necessarily required? I mean, I can see how if I have an 80-acre farm and I want to divide it into 81-acre lots, it might have been zoned agricultural before, and it would be zoned residential if I wanted to do that subdivision. But if I have a large piece of property that's already zoned SFR, and I want to subdivide it, do I necessarily need a rezone, or do I just get a subdivision?
It's a great question, and you don't necessarily, you'll let me know if I don't answer this properly, but you don't necessarily need to do a rezone in conjunction with a given PUD. In this case, in the city of Sandpoint, you don't have an overlay district that is basically called PUD. And so we would take through, when we take through an application for a PUD and a zone change at the same time, when we take through a PUD and a subdivision application at the same time, it's likely that we'll bring you a zone change concurrently with those applications, just to get us the most consistent zoning designation that the city has for what the developer has in mind. In some jurisdictions, you might write the code such that when you do approve a PUD, it gets an automatic rezone on top of it. And basically it has its very own zoning ordinance. That's essentially how the city of Boise approved the Harris Ranch development, which it has kind of its very own zoning ordinance, its very own landscape standards, density standards, street standards, all of those things are unique only to Harris Ranch. And that was done through the PUD process. Is that getting at your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Darren, if I may add just a bit of, I guess, a different way to think of it. This is how I was able to absorb the difference between the two processes. So it may or may not help each one. I see a PUD as a negotiation, and a preliminary plat and ultimately a final plat is how we legally subdivide land, right? So you could have just a subdivision as long as you're complying strictly with code and you're not asking for anything to vary from code, the zoning code, then you just go forward with a preliminary plat approval and you complete your infrastructure and then you get a final plat. A PUD, as Darren mentioned at the front end, it's that negotiation of, look, this is the big picture that we'd really like to achieve here. And in doing so, we're going to need to have a conversation about the code. So I wouldn't dare call it a variance because it's far more than that. But it's providing some more leeway in that regard versus if we just came to you, let's say with a preliminary plat approval, you have to comply with the code very prescriptively. Minimum lot size, street widths, there's no wiggle room at all.
Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, we've seen through experience here that preliminary plats can get approved by city council that don't apply code.
Respectfully, I think that there's areas where, and Fonda can certainly speak to this more specifically, but there are areas of code that do require some application to the actual request in front of the commission and the council. But respectfully, a plat can't be approved if it's not compliant with the code. So no, they haven't approved something that's not substantially compliant with city code without a PUD or a variance being issued.
Is it usually the city that nudges developers to go to group PUD, or do developers come asking for this as an option?
I have a thought on that, but I'll let Darren speak to it. He's certainly done a lot more PUDs.
Amanda, could you please repeat the question just so I make sure I got it right?
I can read it. Darren, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I asked if typically the city that nudges developers to go through the PUD process as opposed to subdivision or rezone, or if developers are more interested in pursuing PUD as opposed to the other options.
You know, typically developers who do PUDs are the ones that are really interested in building like legacy projects. They're the ones that will take the time and effort to do the upfront planning and see a multi-year, multi-phase project through the process. If you're just somebody that wants to take 5 acres and, you know, build 5,000-foot lots because, you know, you can sell those all day long to builders, then there's really no advantage to you to do a PUD. Cities like developers to do PUDs because, you know, there's a lot more certainty for the public and the developer built into them, and you get a bigger or a better project out of it. It does, you know, sometimes introduce, I would say it introduces more costs on the developers frequently because, you know, they're building a better product.
One of the examples Amanda pointed to as a recent, well, somewhat recent PUD, the Cedars. How is that any different than a subdivision? What are the additional land uses that we see in there besides houses with sidewalks and streets? I don't see any mixed use, residential, commercial, or I mean, there's a little bit of open space in there, but I believe the city owns some of that. Like, why is that different than any other subdivision?
There's several differences. Great question. So they did get some leeway on their minimum standards for the street widths. Their right of way in that subdivision is substandard compared to what our code requires. They have an increase in density per lot size, and there is multifamily. You're correct, there's no commercial, but that's not a necessary component. There is multifamily. Yeah. And then yes, there is the park. And I'm actually really glad you brought that up because I'll take the opportunity to give you an update on that. Part of the PUD required that they complete Maddie Lane and construct it to the north so that the public could drive to the park. That portion of the PUD and the plat was not completed at that time. They are working towards completing it now so that we'll be able to have some public access beyond just foot, as well as give access to those 3 lots. So lot size standards, there were a variety of conditions in that regard that allowed them to build what they did. But you're right, on the surface you drive through, it looks like, you know, how is this any different? But it is different.
So it sounds like in that case, the developer got some concessions from the city.
Mhm.
When I look at these beautiful drawings here on the screen, I see a lot of things that the city gets, like more public open space. And,
Mhm.
you know, our comp plan describes a lot of mixed use residential, commercial types of development where there's, you know, people can walk to the store and so on. And those are, I think, things that are in the interest of the city and our vision. That, I guess, in the case of Cedars again, what did the city get?
That city park wasn't ours. It was
So that
actually
was part of,
Mhm.
so that was dedicated to the city.
correct. So the
Okay.
PUD code provides that you have to provide 10% of public space
Okay.
associated, a
That's a good piece of
minimum.
information.
So that became ours as a result of that PUD process. It was previously owned by the developers, private land, in fact, waterfront land. So it's a pretty cool space in that regard. As far as the commercial component, I think one thing we haven't really talked about where it just adds another layer of complexity. So Darren, chime in here when I misstep because it may happen, but is the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan around the Cedars at Sand Creek doesn't provide that we said we wanted commercial in that area. So these PUDs need to be consistent with the comprehensive plan and that overall vision, or they're coming forward, and this goes back to the rezone conversation, right? So that area of town was not contemplated for anything such as commercial, because I assume at that time, as is actually in the staff report, you know, it's within a half a mile, a quarter of a mile of lots of commercial development. So it's just based upon each individual development.
And I mean, it's a good point. I should have mentioned, of course, that we always start with the comprehensive plan, and essentially, you know, the rezone component gets us closer to conformance with the comprehensive plan in a lot of cases. Arguably, if you're doing a PUD, you don't necessarily have to do a rezone because it, you know, it takes the place of the standards, but you do need sort of a base zone to work from, you know, a place to start from. And that's where the rezone is handy because it gives you that conformance with the comp plan.
Any other questions from the commission? Darren? No? Okay, thank you, Darren. Do you have anything else to add?
Not on PUDs. If you're done with that, I thought we could talk about a new zoning ordinance.
Absolutely.
Could we get a copy of this presentation too? That would be helpful to me to have on file.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And if you thought PUDs were brief, I'm going to keep this extra special brief as well. I think Amanda gave you the scope of work that I prepared just as a starting point. And I've got a single slide here for you that I pulled directly out of that scope of work, which is basically a 6-step process. Well, it's actually a 5-step scope of work for creating a new zoning ordinance. And so I'm going to walk you through this, just what I was thinking, stressing 2 things from the outset. One is that is very much in draft form and very much open to, negotiation and input from the commission. And that's really what we'd like tonight, is to hear from you on how you think this process ought to run. And so just briefly, by way of an overview, the table that you see in front of you talks about critical updates. We've been, keeping a tally of things that we think are problematic within the existing ordinance. And there's a few things in there that really need to come in front of you guys and right away. And so we intend to bring those forward here within the next month or so as a modest package of improvements just to help us in the day-to-day administration of the zoning ordinance. What we don't want to do is get into the plumbing problem where, you know, everything we touch touches 5 other things downstream, and then, you know, we're into a whole ordinance rewrite. We've just got some real discrete critical things that we want to get fixed, and so we'll bring those to you here within the next month or two, kind of depending on workload, as you've heard about. With regard to the zoning ordinance itself, we've had a number of discussions on this, and I've urged your team to consider this as a comprehensive rewrite. What I've seen over and over again with zoning ordinances all throughout the state is that people do those critical updates. You know, they fix discrete things, and you know, you're doing zoning ordinance updates kind of constantly and throughout the year or whatever, or at least 1 or 2 a year. And then pretty soon you've got this Franken ordinance that doesn't talk to itself very well, where it has a lot of internal inconsistency and inconsistent language, and just very difficult for the staff to administer. And we want to avoid that process. And so for that reason, or that result, and so for that reason, I recommend that we really do this in a comprehensive way. So to that end, what is proposed in that scope of work in front of you is that we first propose a new structure for the zoning ordinance. And that is, how would we have this thing organized so that it's internally consistent and that all the zones are clearly labeled and work well together, that the administration of the code is clearly laid out, and that the regulations are also clearly laid out. So there's this kind of those 3 areas of the zoning ordinance that it regulates. And so we want to make sure we get the organization right. So think of that as basically a new table of contents. And I think we can, you know, produce that relatively quickly. Once we have that, then it would be a process of scrubbing the existing ordinance, basically identifying those things that we think are valuable and that we want to keep, and bringing that over to the new ordinance. And then identifying where the gaps are, like what is the existing ordinance silent on, now that we've brought everything over that we think is valuable and that it's located in the proper place, and that the language is you know, written in a way that is you know, makes sense and is a more modern language or syntax. What are we missing? What are the gaps within the ordinance? And so that would be phase 3, is once we've identified those gaps, then is going in to draft the balance of the ordinance. Is basically taking that fully complete draft ordinance out to the public, and, you know, listening to what they have to say, fielding questions. Why did you do this that way? Why is this here? Why did you leave that out? Those sorts of things. And then at that point, you know, we would have once we get through that process, we would have a final draft that we could take through the adoption process, which is, of course, your typical public hearing process through the Planning and Zoning Commission and the City Council. So backing up, what I'm really interested in is what your opinions are on both using the Planning and Zoning Commission as our citizen advisory committee. You see a lot of applications where you're at, but I think you don't get to do as much planning. And so this is kind of putting the planning back in the Planning and Zoning Commission. But secondly, and just as importantly, is what your opinions are on how we reach out to the public on this, through this process. And I just want, just by way of a little anecdote, so I can tell you what I'm afraid of in getting into the process and doing public engagement too early. And what the trade-offs are here is that when we do a plan, whether it's a comprehensive plan or a corridor plan or a neighborhood plan or whatever, those plans are very aspirational and they're written at a very high level. They're about, you know, the dreams and hopes and desires of the community for the community through time. What is the built environment going to look like through time? What are we going to leave our children? And so they're necessarily written at a very high level, and they're very, you know, very aspirational. The zoning ordinance, on the other hand, is the actual law that is meant to implement that plan. It's meant to say, okay, you expressed a desire to have density in this area, lower density in that area. How are we actually going to make that a reality on the ground? We need to write the rules so that when people come in to do projects, that we get the kind of development that the plan envisions. And what oftentimes happens when you go into a zoning ordinance rewrite and you're too early in the process, you end up relitigating your planning documents. And rather than writing an ordinance that is a modern best practices zoning ordinance for getting good mixed use development in the city, you end up relitigating all the planning that you've done that preceded the zoning ordinance. And so for that reason, what I was thinking, or what I had in mind with this phase one on the outline process, was that we first give the public something to react to. Rather than going out before we put anything on paper, I would say let's reorganize the code, or at least propose an organization, and then take that to the public and start the conversation from there, so that there's something to react to. And then similarly with phase two, once we bring over what we think is valuable and important from the existing ordinance, that we then start to have a much more detailed conversation with the public. When we craft the public engagement plan, which we'll do before we start this process, I would envision that the commission, acts as our citizen guide on this. And that before we do any public engagement, we're going to you, the commission, to discuss what we're proposing and why. And then only then do we go out to the public and kind of have a broader conversation about it. And so I think I'll leave my comments just right there, and then let the commission have a discussion about how you see a process like this running, and answer any questions as I can.
Well, I have some questions, as usual, it seems like. In the past, Darren, I have been frustrated sometimes that our zoning has not caught up with our comp plan, or does not actually reflect our comp plan. And with the most recent development on the UI property, I felt like that developer worked hard to align the planning with the urban area transportation plan, but it was kind of at the expense of the comp plan. And I did not recommend to council that they accept the plan for the UI property that they ultimately did. Will this process identify places, two things: one, where zoning does not reflect the vision of the comp plan, and two, where the vision of the comp plan is in conflict with the vision of the urban area transportation plan? And will we have an opportunity, if the comp plan and the transportation plan do not agree, to decide which we want to prioritize? And by we, I mean everyone in town, not me or the commission.
Oh, sure. Let's go right to the hardest question first.
Wait, and Darren, before you start, I'd like to make one comment on that. I think it would be really helpful, because you bring up a really good point. As we start into this process, Darren can answer your question specifically, but as we start into this process, it's going to be really important that we not talk about these things in generalities. So start identifying where it concerns you, that you think zoning might be in conflict with the comprehensive plan, or where zoning might be in conflict with the urban area transportation plan, very specifically. So as we start scrubbing in stage 2, we really can keep what is useful and meaningful and address exactly the concern that you're talking about. So I want to make that comment to really hit some specifics on that, where you have really identifiable areas and concerns that this is happening, so that we don't overlook any of those in that scrubbing process.
And I guess also, my concern upon is, I don't know where those are. And will this process help us find those?
So I'll let Darren answer that
Yeah.
process question.
So this gets right to the crux of what we're going to be working on, and this is really the difficulty. So the planning school answer is that yes, you absolutely have to have a zoning ordinance that can implement your plan. And one of the worst things in the world to have are plan zone conflicts. The second worst thing after a plan zone conflict is just to have your code silent where your plan is very strong. So you need your code to be flexible enough to do a lot of things, but it can't do everything, right? It can, there are limitations, and you all are on the commission because you are good at weighing trade-offs and making those kind of decisions, right? Because everything we do is a trade-off, but it also has to be legal, you know? And that's where the ordinance comes in. And I think where you will be very valuable is as we workshop this process, as we go through the process, we can, you know, do a whole workshop on the provisions of the plan, and we can go, basically what we can do as a group is go and try and process a hypothetical application. We can go through the plan, find a discrete area where something, you know, notable is planned and we would really like to see in the city. And let's go see if we can make that happen through the existing ordinance. My hunch is that the ordinance that we have does some of those things really well, but it's more silent in a lot of areas rather than being in conflict. And so the situation you're describing, I think what worries me almost more than whether or not the zoning ordinance will be flexible enough to implement the plan is whether our planning documents are consistent between themselves. Because when you get into the weeds of a transportation plan, that in its own self can be at odds with a comprehensive plan. You know, there will just be things in a transportation plan that don't fit well in a comp plan. Because if the goal of the transportation plan is to, for instance, to have level of service C or something, you know, to that level, that means moving a lot of traffic, which is sometimes antithetical to other things that you're trying to plan for or get with development. And so, yes, the process will be designed to identify those areas where we have friction, but we'll never be able to, I think, solve the discussion that, or sort of the problem that you're presenting, at least solve it entirely, because that's where the judgment of the commission is going to come in weighing these, you know, public benefits.
I think your suggestion that we are gonna, as part of this process, take a hypothetical development and see how it would look. It would be great to be able to compare how it would look under, if we have a bunch of different suggested zones, and just try to envision what would be the effect of this zoning change. Will it create a wall? Will it create a 4-lane highway? Will it create a traffic jam? Will it create a lot of noise? I think it's really hard for me to know what, to envision what the results of our efforts are going to be. I know that was really difficult for me when we wrote the zoning code, whenever it was we wrote it. Unless that carried back in 2008. So I think that's a great idea, Darren. I appreciate that. I think for me, that would be very helpful. I have two other little questions that I think are way easier to answer. One of them is on this chart here, under key tasks in that top cell on the right-hand side, there is the term P and Z pre-application. What does that refer to?
Where are we at on there?
It's on this slide number 10 under potential workflow key tasks. The very first bullet item is P and Z pre-application.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's what we would want to do is bring to you the package of amendments basically in a work session before we get into a public hearing situation, so that we can show you what we're proposing and why before we actually prepare that application. And that's just to get some input and let you know what we're thinking and why, see what we're missing, you know, those kind of things. typically, we do all pre-applications at the staff level, but in this case, we'd be proposing ordinances that you're going to see in a public hearing. And so we just want to give you a little time to digest that so that it doesn't catch you by surprise at the public.
Okay. The other one was, and maybe you're not the person to ask this potential workflow table came to us as part of a 5-page PDF called Agenda Item 6B City Code Amend, which is not all that useful. But it, as part, I guess it expanded the things in this table. And under task 2, scrub, under task 2.2, potential public engagement, a bullet item is briefing of Mayor's Zoning Advisory Committee, ? What is the Mayor's Zoning Advisory Committee and how does it relate to the Planning and Zoning Commission?
Amanda, can you help me out with that one?
Sure. From a potential scope perspective, I think some of the task items were brought forward from other jurisdictions when they do a code amendment. These are some options that have been considered in the past. So for example, the mayor has, and several council members have been having a broader conversation about housing, right? And if there's going to be, let's say, a housing task force, is that a stakeholder group that we would want to engage as part of this overall zoning ordinance update? So that's hence the question mark. It's definitely a draft about which makes sense, but it's just if we have subcommittees. So for example, our historic commission, right? Like, would we want to go to them? It's kind of a placeholder in that regard.
Generic name for advice. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I take it, Darren, based on one of your recent comments, that there's already several amendments planned that you expect to present to us in this pre-application this summer. How does that fit in with like the scrub? Like I view this in a chronological order and scrubbing the existing ordinance, but it sounds like you already have some amendments in mind that you've already planned that you might be bringing to us sooner than we get to, task 2 or 3. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. Those were, for instance, this would be the level of detail that we'd be talking about. Right now, the commercial C zoning designation allows for multifamily developments, but it doesn't point back to the multifamily development standards in the RM zone. And so we're basically flying blind. It further requires a 2-story structure that has like a storefront character to it, which is inconsistent with sort of where the commercial C zoning designation exists within the city. And so a very just brief and small amendment that we'd like to do is put a footnote in that land use table that says when you're doing multifamily in commercial C, go use the multifamily standards that are in the RM zone.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? Are there any questions from members of the public who are here tonight? I was instructed to ask if there was anybody attending tonight who might have a comment or question on this matter. Yes. Please. Yes, please come to the podium and introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Carrie Logan. I live in the city limits of Sandpoint. I know all of you like we talked about roundabouts. Jason, I haven't met you before. A little background on me before my comments. For about 6 years in the mid-90s to early 2000s, I served on the Planning and Zoning Commission. Beginning in 2008, I served the city for 8 years, both as a council member and as mayor. And I've also served on the City Historic Preservation Commission. I read with interest the agenda item regarding code revisions and have some comments to make about that. It seems to me, and historically has been so, that code is created and revised after a comprehensive plan is in place. We have a very robust plan in place which yielded the current codes. Planning department undertook an update to the comprehensive plan several years ago, but that has been either shelved or placed on the back burner. I would strongly suggest that the path forward with code revisions comes after the update is completed. I'm aware of recent turnover in the planning department. Rather than use consultants who have no grounding in Sandpoint, it would seem proper to focus on recruiting and retaining a skilled planner to head the department, and combined with planning know-how and on-the-ground knowledge of our town, then undertake completion of the comp plan update to be followed by code revisions. I would also encourage a very robust public involvement plan for all changes to plans and code. And I would hope you as a commission would advocate for these ideas or some version. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Logan. Is there anybody else from the public who would like to speak? Darren, do you have anything else for us?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, staff, I think, is there anything else on the agenda? I think that's it. With that, I think we're ready to adjourn. Thank you.